first Bubble Bobble was a whopping arcade success in the mid-80s, resulting in many ports of it to follow. The game stars two boys turned cute twin dragons named Bub and Bob, get it? On their quest to rescue their girlfriends. Then there's Bubble Bobble Part 2, notice the word part there, that was released in 1993 and is a tough one to track down for NES enthusiasts. There was no arcade version of this installment, and the NES and Game Boy versions were developed separately and have different storylines. But there were two games in the series released between Bubble Bobble and Bubble Bobble Part 2. One was Rainbow Islands, the story of Bubble Bobble 2, and yeah, that's still Bub and Bob. They're just in their human form there, but really if it weren't for having Bubble Bobble in the subtitle, you might not know they were related. This is similarly true for the third game in the series titled Parasol Stars, the story of Bubble Bobble 3, that was developed for the TurboGrafx before being ported to the NES, but only in PAL regions where it was titled Parasol Stars, the story of Rainbow Islands 2. I don't know why they had to make the titling so confusing, but hopefully it now makes sense. So, all that said, Bubble Bobble Part 2 is technically the fourth game in the series, based on the plot I'll cover here shortly. So, let's see what's up. It's immediately apparent Bubble Bobble is an arcade game at heart, but thankfully it's not of the more brutal variety more common in its day. You take control of Bob and Bub, little dragon boys whose girlfriends Betty and Patty went for a walk in a nearby forest and became lost, eventually ending up in a cave of monsters where they were kidnapped by a villain named Super Drunk who has them trapped at the bottom of a 100-floor cave. As you make your way through the caves, you can hop on platforms and blow bubbles. The goal is to trap enemies in the bubbles and then pop the bubbles to get the prize inside, which amounts to points. There are some special bubbles that can create a special effect, like a lightning bolt bubble that shoots across the screen, or a fire bubble that ignites the floor to take out enemies. And if you pop the bubbles with the letters in them to spell out the word extend, you get an extra life. 100 levels sounds like an awful lot, but some of them go by super fast if the enemies are easy to get to. Some others can be head scratchers as you'll need to figure out how to navigate around the screen in the allotted time to wipe out the enemies, and Bub and Bob have somewhat limited mobility. It's essential to learn how to use the bubbles for more than just trapping enemies, as using them to ascend up the screen is necessary for completing some levels. The good news is you can't die by falling. Even through holes in the floor, you'll just reappear at the top. One last note to this one is that Bubble Bobble is one of the earliest games to have multiple endings. Mild spoiler alert here if you care about Bubble Bobble lore, but if you defeat the final boss with a single player, you get what is essentially a bad ending, and the game encourages you to go find a friend and do it again. And even if you do, you'll only get what is considered the good ending, and the game tells you how to access Super Bubble Bobble, and you do it over again. If you and your friend beat Super Bubble Bobble, then and only then do you get the true ending. It's a lot of bubble bubbling. All said, Bubble Bobble is plenty of fun and probably gets the acclaim it does due to the accessibility of it. It's not hard. In fact, if you pick up a floating parasol, the game skips you ahead a few levels. The final boss is kind of a stinker though, so good luck with him. Next up is Rainbow Islands, the true sequel to Bubble Bobble. This time you'll notice there aren't cute little dragons jumping around the screen anymore, and instead you're in control of young boys. Well, no worries, that is still Bub and Bob, just in their human form. Here they have to rescue the inhabitants of Rainbow Islands because the evil Dark Shadow transformed them into tiny dragons, as Bub and Bob were. You're asking, if they're all dragons like Bub and Bob were, why don't they blow some bubbles and kick butt like Bub and Bob did in the first game? And I don't know the answer to that. There are 3 endings here again though, depending on how many big diamonds you collect throughout your playthrough. It's not terribly obvious you need to do this, but the manual does allude to it. Anyway, here the mechanics and flow are completely different. Instead of bubbles, you shoot rainbows. Yep, you shoot 1 rainbow and sometimes 2 rainbows if you get a power-up. The rainbows can kill enemies if you hit them with it. There are a number of ways to kill enemies with rainbows, which is a bit of an odd juxtaposition. You can use the rainbows as makeshift stairs for climbing the stage as you did with the bubbles in the first game. You can have 4 on screen at a time, so that's something to keep in mind as you scale upward. And that's the goal, getting higher. You don't have to collect every gem or kill every enemy, you just need to survive. But again, if you want the true ending, you'll need to seek out the 7 special diamonds. Just don't let the first few levels tease you into thinking this game is overly simple. It eventually gets pesky, but thankfully it's not too punishing as there are infinite continues to help you along. In total, there are 7 levels with 4 stages, but each stage has multiple screens. In reality, it probably comes to 100 total screens like the first game, but they can go by quick if you get adept at scaling. Each level ends with a boss fight, something that the first game didn't do. The boss battles are neat additions and a good break from the near mindless monotony of the rest of the game. All said, if you enjoyed Bobble, Rainbow Islands works differently but amounts to the same level of fun. Instead of going down, you're ascending up. Instead of blowing bubbles, you blow rainbows. I had some issues maneuvering on the rainbows at times, and the jumping feels a little stiff, but aside from that, this one is about what you'd expect. The third game in the series arms you with an umbrella, or parasol, that you use to, I guess, impale enemies, and then launch them at other enemies. The stages are arranged a lot like the first Bobble, where you just need to clear a single stage of enemies instead of climbing several. In Parasol Stars, stages have monster machines that continuously spawn enemies, and your goal is to wipe that out and any remaining enemies on screen. To do so, you impale an enemy with a parasol and flick it at the machine, or pick up the water droplets dripping around and use those the same way. There are plenty of ways to kill in the whimsical world of Bobble to reap the delicious fruits of your enemies. There is a total of 8 different worlds in the game, each one with 5 stages before a boss fight. In the boss fights, you usually get power-ups that arm your droplet-slinging parasol with an effect like lightning or fire that inflicts damage on the boss. Floating down will charge up the attack and then you unleash it for maximum damage. The boss fights are definitely of the more fun parts of the game. Some of the stages are frustratingly designed, like this one early on where you have to grab the triangles when they're at the edge. That doesn't seem intuitive, and no, you can't climb in this section from the bottom. It can sometimes seem tricky for the sake of being tricky and not for any clever reason, but all in all, like Bobble and Rainbow Islands, it's a simple game with simple concepts. But Parasol Stars doesn't have unlimited continues, so picking up the food and collectibles are important as they earn you credits. This wrinkle might make this one the most difficult of the 4 games covered today. Oh yeah, and as the story goes here, after saving the villagers of Rainbow Islands, Bub and Bob are enjoying some rest until the mad warrior Chaosticon unleashes some monsters on the universe. No bueno. Armed with the magic parasol given to them by the Rainbow Island villagers, they have to defeat the monsters and protect the universe. Now to the 4th game, Bobble Part 2. Even the manual and box are conflicting in terms of who you are in this game because, if it hasn't been apparently obvious from the start, there was really no need for a narrative here and it's all just been tacked on. In the manual, the game is set to star Bub and Bob, the original duo we've come to love over the last 3 games, while the back cover says you're Cubby and Rubby, the descendants of Bub and Bob. There is extra reason to think this might be the case, since in Japan, the Game Boy version of the game is called Bobble Jr., so, you decide. Either way, they're trying to find their friend Judy who was kidnapped by the Skull Brothers. No bueno. This game is the most reminiscent to the first, as you might expect, except with more graphical touches like backgrounds other than black, better animations, and zones with discernible themes. In all, there are 4 different zones with 2 areas each. Each area consists of 10 rounds and ends with a mini-boss. In total, there are 80 rounds here that eventually culminates in a boss fight against Super Drunk, the main boss of the first game, as well as the Skull Brothers. This game also adds a float feature where the characters can float upward if they suck in enough air, but the same old shtick for trapping enemies in bubbles and popping them to defeat them is still here as in the first game. Missing is a simultaneous 2-player mode. Here, you'll have to take turns. As with other games in the series, the level designs and concepts are basic, but here they're at least slightly more complex and interesting. If you ignore the light amount of lore forced into the series, Bobble Part 2 feels more like the true sequel to the original in terms of concept, mechanics, and gameplay, and is a complete upgrade in just about every measurable way. Of the 4 games covered today, you can't go wrong with the original. It's the easiest to find in physical form and is a major piece of gaming history, ranking in just about every top games of all time list ever printed. Bobble Part 2, which goes for more than a month's rent, is almost certainly the better made, better looking, and more refined game of the 4. The ones in the middle, Rainbow Islands and Parasol Stars, are the same level of fun, but different enough to maybe be a turn-off for fans of the original. It's important to note that the fun factor for each of these games are improved by adding a second player. While generally geared toward a younger audience, the games can be enjoyed by anyone looking for a casual experience. These aren't the only games in the series though. Due to the offshoot franchises like Puzzle Bobble and Bust-A-Move, there are plenty of games with Bub and Bob to go around. There's even a new title coming to Switch soon titled Bobble 4 Friends. It was released in Europe on November 19, 2019, and reviews seem favorable. Well, that does it for Bub and Bob on the NES. As always, don't impale anyone with an umbrella. And thanks for watching.